right, thank you for the kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to start by saying a few words about the institute where I'm a director, the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry, and we're in Jena in Germany. And Jena is actually a very important place where Alexander von Humboldt spent some time together with Goethe. It's in the center of Germany here, in the former Eastern German states. It's a beautiful city, and I hope you come and visit us sometime. Very nice place to live. So for those who don't know what biogeochemistry is, in our institute we think about it as the metabolism of the earth. So elements like carbon cycle back and forth in between different chemical forms. So like CO2 in the atmosphere can be fixed by this enzyme here, Rubisco, to make reduced organic compounds. And those can be returned to the atmosphere either through plant respiration or decomposition of plant materials. So when we talk about the biologically mediated transformation of elements and transport of elements, we're talking about an element like carbon moving between inorganic and organic forms through biology. And one of our key challenges is that the Rubisco enzyme is a molecule, and we want to understand its influence on the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the global scale. So we can see the influence of photosynthesis and respiration by annual changes in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, but we want to track that over 17 orders of magnitude back to understanding the process that's actually going on. And that becomes more complicated because at each level of complexity or each level of organization, different processes become important. And so in our institute, what we try to do is use multiple observations at multiple scales to try to understand which processes are most important and how these things interact with each other to understand signals at each of those levels. So the example I can give you is, we know that Rubisco, the rate of the enzyme reaction depends a little bit on the substrate availability, on temperature and things like that. But when we go to a leaf, the rate of photosynthesis depends partly on the amount of Rubisco enzyme that's in the leaf, which is a measure of the availability of nitrogen in that ecosystem. And it might differ from one tree species to another tree species that handles its nutrients in different ways. And it will differ between shade leaves and sunlit leaves. So there's already complexity built in that has nothing to do with the enzymatic process, but has to do with understanding species and a little bit about biodiversity maybe and function. At the level of a flux tower, where we can measure the CO2 exchange between the atmosphere and the forest canopy with instruments that we have above the canopy, we start to have to understand how air exchange is in order to calculate the fluxes. And we're also looking at a community of species rather than just a single one. And so on up to the top, where we can use remote sensing is one way to go across scales because we can now use it, the greenness, to understand something about what's happening even at the tree canopy level with modern observations. But also, so this is part of our challenge as an institute. Coming back to Alexander von Humboldt, the major questions that we're asking are, so there's this complex interaction of different processes that operate at different spatial scales, but at the same time we're trying to understand all those interactions. Everything's changing. So the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is changing. The weather is changing because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is changing. And our major question in our institute is how do terrestrial ecosystems interact with and respond to ongoing climate and land management changes? And can we use our understanding to predict what the future is going to look like with continued climate change? So it's a big challenge. It's sort of a fundamental science challenge on many levels because we have many things changing at the same time and we only have one experiment. And we have no control where the changes aren't happening. So we have to, look at complex systems and use models to do our thought experiments. But going back to Humboldt, whoops, wrong way. Going back to Humboldt, we can see already changes. This is the Chimpazoro mountain, so he was one of the pioneers in linking vegetation and climate together, trying to understand how they interact and influence each other. But if you go back, so someone went back in 2012 and went back on the same hike and found that the species distribution was different. It's a little bit controversial. There's some controversy about this paper, whether it's climate change that causes vegetation shifts or some of the really large-scale changes in land use at the base, but it's certain that the glaciers have retreated and that that is due to warming in this century. Okay, so, but I'm not here to talk mostly about a lot of what our institute does. I'm here to talk about a project that spans across many institutes, and especially the partner institutions are the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry in Mines, the IMPA, the Institute for Amazon Research in Manaus in Brazil, and the University of the Amazonas State in Brazil, in Manaus also. And we have a lot of funding agencies. So I'm going to talk to you about the Amazon Tall Tower Observatory, partly for this audience because, Colombia has the Amazon in it, and this is a big infrastructure project that could be useful either to use data from or to link to climate studies or ecosystem studies in the more western part of the Amazon compared to where Atto is. So Atto is a joint Brazilian-German research infrastructure that basically was built between 2007 and now, and is now ready for really use for lots of investigations. And its main goal is to study the role of intact Amazon forests in global climate and atmospheric composition. And so here's the tower. It's the main thing you can see if you fly above Manaus or above the region is this tower sticking up. It's a 325-meter tall tower. And I want you to note that if you've ever flown across the Amazon, which maybe some people here have done, it's impressive. I mean, it's called the Green Ocean. It really is this large, unbroken expanse of forest. And it's unique in the world because it is so large. So what is Atto really? What's the infrastructure? The infrastructure is this, all the attention goes to the 325-meter tall tower because it's 1 meter taller than the Eiffel Tower, and it's the tallest research tower in South America. So it's a platform to get us up into the atmosphere, a little bit away from the influence of the forest. It cost a lot of money to build and was a big logistical challenge to do in the middle of the forest. So there were 2 80-meter towers that have been operating since 2014. So these are instrumented with a lot of different equipment to look at everything from meteorological variables, radiation, humidity, wind speeds. There's a large group of Brazilian physicists who are looking at turbulence and the exchange of air and the influence of the forest on that. There's chemical measurements, which I'll talk about later, greenhouse gas measurements, and all going on these 80-meter masts for the last 4 years. For the tall tower, we're still installing some of the things. There are a lot of laboratories at the base, climate-controlled laboratories. But I want to convince you, I'm not really a tower person. I once swore that I wouldn't have nothing to do with a tower, and now I get to help coordinate the research at one. So it's not just towers. It's really the focal point for a lot of different research. And the main thing that's good about the Atto, where it's a platform, is that all of these things are being done in the same place in a way that's comparable. So we have, people studying plants and soils, and this is Santiago Botia. He's a Colombian graduate student in our institute who's working on the greenhouse gas measurements. We have clean labs, we have climate-controlled laboratories, we have nice field facilities and good food if you want to visit. So there are about 100 researchers, I would say. I don't actually know the number between Brazilian and German research groups, but there are also other groups who have proposed to work at the site, and we try to accommodate everybody because it's such a unique infrastructure. I think everybody here knows why the Amazon, so it's this large intact tropical forest. Tropical forests don't have a lot of land mass, but they are because they're in the tropics, they cycle enormous amounts of water and carbon and energy, and therefore influence, what happens there influences not just the regional climate, but also the continental climate and even the extracontinental climate. It also, because of where it is, it's some of the pristinest or the cleanest atmosphere on the planet. So you can study what land-atmosphere interactions used to look like before humans put a lot of extra particles and gases in the atmosphere, especially in the northern hemisphere. So that's another reason to study it. It also has a lot of carbon in plants and soils. It's not the lungs of the world, no matter what you hear in the popular press. And if anybody wants to ask a question later, they can ask me why not. I don't have time to explain it now. The other thing is that it's changing fast. I think, this is the fires in August last month when everybody read about Brazilian politics. You can see that you can see all the roads in the southern and western Amazon as the locus point for the fires, which are associated this year. They're more this year because there's more deforestation. But the point about Atto is it's sampling more the wetter parts of the Amazon and the intact forest that has little land use change. And that's part of the reason it is where it is. The other thing is, besides land use, warming in the tropics is going to lead to non-analog vegetation conditions. So this is a plot of the mean annual precipitation and temperature, and these are the envelope of the points that are in all climate models. So the blue points are the historical record, and the 2100 future levels are here in the red points. And what you can see is we talk a lot about the Arctic and climate change in the Arctic, but if you warm the Arctic, we have analog vegetation. We know what it's like when it's warmer, what will grow. But if we warm the tropics, there is no analog tropical forest that exists in the temperatures of a degree or two on average warmer. And so we actually don't know what's going to happen. Will the vegetation adapt to those conditions, or will it change into savanna or something else? We just don't know. And of course, there have been large droughts in the last few years associated with El Nino. We don't know if those are increasing in frequency. We just don't have a long-term observations to really guide us there, or the understanding of what causes them and makes them persist. So our 20-year question, building this big tower, it wasn't just to do measurements for a few years. It really was to accompany the climate change into the future. And see what happens to the forest and try to understand it in time to maybe prevent some of the more catastrophic changes, but at least to understand what might happen. So we want to understand how climate change will influence this, how changes in climate variability, extreme events will cause changes, and then what will be the consequences if the vegetation changes for the region and beyond. So in order to do all that, we're asking a lot of different questions simultaneously because all of these things interact. And I'm going to show you just two examples. One has to do with the water cycle, the exchange of water, and the recycling of water in the Amazon basin, because that has consequences. You've probably all read about the river of water, the atmospheric river that goes the opposite direction of the Amazon, which is draining the area. So you have a lot of recycled water going into the interior. And the other one has to do with the complex interactions between the vegetation, atmospheric chemistry, and cloud formation, and maybe a little bit about greenhouse gases and not so much about processes. So, but they're all important, and the main point is, if you're interested in Atto, is to understand that we're doing all these investigations at once in a single place, and it's really rare, and especially rare in a tropical forest ecosystem. So I'm going to start with the atmospheric chemistry. Basically, the atmosphere is a big reactor, and we have reduced gases like reduced nitrogen gases, reduced carbon gases, these volatile organic carbon, but also gases like methane, which is a volatile organic molecule, coming out of the forest and mixing up into the atmosphere. We have what's called the oxidizing engine of the atmosphere, where we have radiation, splitting water and making this OH radical, which is a highly reactive, very short-lived gas in the atmosphere. It basically oxidizes those reduced carbon compounds ultimately to carbon dioxide. So it's the return of the photosynthesis to the atmosphere. And so I want to break that apart a little bit and show you why it's such a complex thing and how it relates to climate. So we heard yesterday some talks about the many, many, many compounds that are present in plants, and that plants emit some of those to the atmosphere, the volatile ones. And we, as we heard yesterday, we still don't understand what all these compounds do, why the different plants make them. But the plants in tropical forests globally and in the tropics globally, it's the largest single source of these volatile organics to the atmosphere, much, much larger than anything we put in the atmosphere in polluted regions. So here the plants really are controlling the chemistry. If we look at the thing that oxidizes them, the OH radical, which is very, very low in abundance and very difficult to measure, and we add up all the things that we think it reacts with, and we know their fluxes because we're measuring them all at ATO. Basically, we can't account for the amount of OH reactivity that we can measure with adding up all the components. And so there's already, our understanding of atmospheric chemistry, this is the work of the people in mines. There's something fundamental that we're missing in the tropics that right now we can't explain. So that's an ongoing piece of the investigation by the people from the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry. The second thing that happens is the fate of these gases, once they're in the atmosphere, is as they get oxidized, they become more condensable. So they stay less in the vapor phase and they'll go into a solid phase. They have to condense to do that and coagulate with other particles, and ultimately they'll form big enough particles to form what are called cloud condensation nuclei. So this is a particle that's big enough so that you can condense water on the surface, and that's how you form clouds. So even if you have supersaturated water vapor, you need something for the droplet to nucleate on for it to form. And so without the aerosols or the particles that are formed from these volatile gases and in their oxidation products, you don't have clouds and you don't have rain. So, and another mystery at ATO, so here's one of the few measurements that we have, continuous measurements at the tall tower and the small towers. And maybe just in the interest of time, look at the smaller ones here. The 325 meter tower has a lot more particles than the lower levels, 60 meters or 5 meters. And if the particles are coming from the canopy, we would expect the opposite, right? They should decrease as you go up in elevation. But they increased, and it's a long story, but the basic point is they have to actually get sucked up by clouds and then processed and then come back down for them to actually be able to form clouds at the level that they do. So that was a big thing. And of course, ongoing investigations are also showing what happens when you pollute that atmosphere. So we're studying the pristine atmosphere, but in the dry season, of course, we have imported smoke. I don't know if this is going to work. Probably not. No, my film doesn't work. So just a few words about water balance, because I'm getting close on time here. How much of the precipitation is recycled is really a question. This is a picture from 300 meters. You can see we have clouds above and clouds below. And one of the big questions is how these things interact during the course of a day. So we've done, our group has done some studies of what's the partitioning of rainfall that falls, how much of it gets re-evaporated. And in forests near Manaus, it's about 60%. Goes back to the atmosphere, and 40% goes down rivers. And we do that with a combination of, very detailed measurements of what goes up the tree stems, and a mass balance of what is going back and forth at the top of the canopy. So we have this estimate for 1 year. We want to know how it varies from 1 year to the next when we might have a very long or a very short dry season. And one of the ways we're going to do that is with isotopes, but I don't really have time to talk about that. I just want to show you one more example, which is this forest-atmosphere carbon balance, just to show you what the tall tower sees and why we have the tall tower there. This is a backtracking of air parcels that are coming to the tower in the wet season and in the dry season. And these are measurements of CO2 at the 80-meter tower compared to clean air upwind in those two directions. And so we can compare these to what we see with the 80-meter tower is mostly the influence of the forest. But so by going above to 325 meters, we should be able to say whether the Amazon is a net source or sink of CO2 on those timescales. So I'm going to skip through all the other things here. There's an awful lot to learn, and I'd encourage you to go to the website for the project, atto.org. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, so you can find all that there. We try to communicate a lot of the science that we do. And just, I'll stop with this. What I think makes it so special, we have multiple disciplines working together at the same place. We have continuous multi-year observations with high precision and accuracy, so we can look at variations from year to year or in the 20 years to go. And we have state-of-the-art tools that allow multiple observations to constrain our understanding of the system. So I'm going to stop there and thank you very much.